Ruth Calloway was 26 years old the day the town of Cutter's Flat watched her well collapse in front of 41 witnesses, including the Reverend, the schoolteacher,
Good to see you,
and the man
Thomas.
she was
How's the
supposed to
harvest
marry
been?
in October.
Bless, John.
The dedication had been
These
scheduled
apples
for
are the
10 in the morning
finest in
after the
years.
harvest social, so that the whole basin could see the co-op's new communal well go into service. Ruth had been given the digging contract not because anyone believed in her, but because her price was the lowest and her parcel, the old Tanner lot, rocky, dry, sitting on a limestone shelf everyone agreed was cursed dirt, had taught her to dig cheap and deep out of necessity. She had sunk the shaft to 51 feet in 19 days, cribbed it with green oak planking sheet cut, and cured herself, and told the co-op board it would hold. At 10:14, with the crank lowered and the first bucket rising, the cribbing groaned. A hollow, splitting sound, like a wagon axle giving way. Then the north wall of the shaft folded inward, and 40 feet of packed clay and shattered oak dropped into the well all at once. The rope snapped taut and threw the bucket into the crowd. Nobody was hurt, but 3 sheep bolted, a table of pies went over, and Amos Pruitt, the basin's most respected driller, a man who had refused Ruth's cribbing method on sight, stood up on a hay bale so the whole crowd could hear him. "Told you," he said. "You can't shore a shaft with green wood and a girl's arithmetic. Water don't care how deep you dig if the hole won't stand." The co-op board rescinded her contract that afternoon. By evening, Thomas Reyes, the schoolteacher she'd been engaged to since spring, had walked the 2 miles from town to her father's house, not to break things off outright, but to say, gently, that his aunt in Modesto had written offering him a position, and that maybe it was time to think about whether Cutter's Flat was where his life ought to be built. He didn't say the collapse had anything to do with it. He didn't have to. Ruth Calloway had inherited the Tanner lot from an uncle nobody spoke of fondly, a hard 40 acres too rocky to plow and too shallow-watered to graze, sitting on ground the county surveyor's map marked simply as unfavorable. She had taken it because nothing else was offered to her, a woman with no husband and no brothers to claim better land, and because her grandfather, Eli Calloway, had once told her that the basin's worst ground sat atop its oldest water so old and so deep that no one alive had learned to reach it. He had died 3 winters before, a well digger by trade for 40 years, and had left her nothing but the parcel, a mule named Solomon, and a leather-bound notebook she had not opened since his funeral. For 6 days after the collapse, she did not touch a shovel. She sat instead with the wreckage of her own name. The general store's ledger, which had once extended her credit against future well contracts, now required cash. 2 families who'd asked her to sink stock wells that fall quietly hired a driller from Sacramento instead. Her hired hand, a lean, sun-cracked young man named Caleb Whitfield who had worked her digs for 2 years on promise of future wages, began speaking of a cousin's cattle operation up near Redding that was hiring hands outright, paid weekly. It was Caleb, in fact, who found the notebook. He'd been mucking out the tool shed and come across it wrapped in oilcloth inside an old feed sack, and he brought it to her without a word, setting it on the porch step beside her like a man setting down something he suspected was a trap. She opened it that night by lamplight. Eli Calloway's hand was small and careful, the writing of a man who had learned late in life that ink was worth rationing. Page after page recorded wells he'd dug across 3 counties, depths, strata, water yields in gallons per hour, the cost of blasting powder against the cost of hand-chiseling through shale. But it was the entries from 1841, decades before Ruth was born, that stopped her. Eli had dug a well on ground much like the Tanner lot. Limestone shelf, poor topsoil, a reputation for dryness, and he had failed twice before succeeding on the 3rd attempt. His notes on the 3rd well were meticulous in a way the others weren't. Underlined twice. Cribbing must breathe with the clay, not fight it. Green oak swells wet and splits dry. Kiln the planking 3 weeks minimum. Join with pegged mortise, not nail. Below 30 feet, seal every 4 feet with a puddled clay collar 8 inches thick, tamped by hand. or the shaft drinks its own walls. Depth is not the enemy of a well. Haste is. Ruth read the page 4 times. Her collapse had come at 40 feet, in soft ground below a limestone cap, exactly where her grandfather had marked the danger with 2 lines under a single word: collar. She had not sealed it. She had not had time, with the dedication deadline set by the co-op board. And she had used green-cut oak because it was cheaper and faster than paying to have planking kiln-dried in town. The middle of that autumn passed for Ruth in near solitude. She did not return to the Tanner lot with any announcement, and no one in Cutter's flat expected her to. She worked mostly alone, with Caleb beside her more out of habit than conviction, and Solomon the mule pulling the windlass rope with an increasingly foul temper. He had taken, since the collapse, to balking at the well's edge, ears flat, refusing the harness some mornings entirely, as though the animal himself distrusted the ground. She dug a new test shaft 40 yards from the ruined one, smaller in diameter, telling no one. She spent $11 of her dwindling savings on kiln-dried oak from the mill in Placer, planed and mortised the cribbing herself by lantern light through October, and dug in careful 4-foot increments, tamping a puddled clay collar by hand after every stage exactly as the notebook instructed, packing it so tight her palms blistered and split. It was slow work. Where her first well had gone 40 feet in 19 days, this one went 20 feet in 22. It was in the second week of this quiet digging that Caleb told her he meant to leave. He said it plainly, sitting on the shaft's timber collar with his hat in his hands, not looking at her. "I got a wage waiting in Reading, Miss Calloway. Steady work. I don't know what's down there, and I don't know that I can afford to keep finding out on promise." He did not say he'd lost faith in her. He didn't have to. Ruth did not argue with him. She said nothing that night at all. But the next morning, she was in the shaft before dawn, and when Caleb arrived, he found she had already tamped a full clay collar alone in the dark, working by lantern in a space barely wide enough for her shoulders, her hands raw. She said only, "This collar's yours to check, if you're still here at noon." She did not ask him to stay. She gave him a task instead, one that mattered, one only he could verify against the notebook's measurements. He checked it. He stayed. By the second week of November, at 62 feet, 11 feet deeper than her first, failed shaft, the auger bit came up wet, and by evening the shaft held 4 feet of standing water that did not recede overnight. Ruth tested it 3 times before she believed the reading. 340 gallons an hour, steady, cold, and clean, drawn from a stratum her grandfather's notes called the Old Table. Water laid down, by his reckoning, before the basin's rivers had cut their present courses. She told almost no one. The town had already decided what kind of well-digger she was. Only one person came to see it. Widow Esther Okafor, 71 years old, who ran 11 head of cattle on a dry parcel 2 miles east and had lost half her herd's water source to a spring that failed in August. Esther had been the lone voice on the co-op board to vote against rescinding Ruth's contract, and she walked the 2 miles out to the Tanner lot in late November on nothing but Ruth's word. She lowered a tin cup on a string herself, drank, and said only, "Your grandfather taught you right," in the end. Then she asked Ruth to dig her a well on the same principle, quietly, before the ground froze. Through that winter, the signs gathered the way such signs do, noticed by almost no one, and dismissed by those who did notice. The basin's rainfall in the wet months ran nearly 40% below the 10-year average, a figure the county agent posted in the feed store and nobody much discussed. Cutter's Flat's shallow public wells, dug to 20 and 25 feet in the old style, held steady through winter but showed unusual drawdown by February, a full month earlier than any local well digger, Amos Pruitt included, could recall. Amos himself said publicly that a dry winter meant nothing. The basin had weathered dry winters before, and would again, and there was no cause for the county to spend money boring test wells on Esther Okafor's say-so. Esther believed otherwise, and said so at every meeting she could get herself invited to, alone, unbacked, and mostly unheard. By June, the drought had a name. The Basin Dry. People were already calling it. And by July it had teeth. The creek that fed Cutter's Flats public trough ran to mud. Stock wells failed across the county in the order their depths predicted. The shallowest first, then the middling ones, until even Amos Pruitt's own 40-foot well, the deepest he had ever dug and the one he had staked his reputation on for a decade, began drawing sand. It was the second week of August when the crisis came due. Amos Pruitt had gone down his own shaft that morning to clear what he believed was a jammed pump valve, lowered on a bosun's chair by his son, when the walls, dry now for weeks, the clay shrunk and cracked from the very drought that had emptied them, let go above him. Not a total collapse, but enough. 18 feet of loosened shale and packed earth slid down around him, pinning his chair, filling the shaft to his chest, and cutting off, in the space of a few seconds, both his air of easy authority and a good portion of his actual air. His son's shouting carried across 2 parcels. Ruth was hauling water for Esther's cattle less than half a mile off, and she was the second person to reach the Pruitt well, after Amos's son and before anyone from town. She stood at the collapsed shaft's edge for perhaps 4 seconds, long enough that she would remember, afterward, every one of them, and her first instinct betrayed her. She reached for the Pruitt well's own windlass rope, the ordinary way, the way she would have gone down before the tanner lot ever taught her different, and got as far as looping it under her arms before she stopped herself, because the ordinary way was exactly what had already half-buried the man beneath her. A straight-down rope offered no way to brace against another slide, no way to shore as she went. She dropped the rope. She sent Caleb, who had arrived at a run behind her, back to the tanner lot for the mortised cribbing section stacked and kiln-dried and ready in her tool shed. Planking cut for a well she hadn't yet dug, meant for Esther's second parcel. And while he was gone, she and Amos's son built a simple standing frame over the collapsed shaft's mouth, wedged and braced against the 2 solid uprights of the old windlass posts. When Caleb returned with the mule cart, she went down inside a lowered, boxed cribbing section rather than on an open rope, packing loosened shale back against the walls as she descended, for feet at a time, exactly as her grandfather's notebook had taught her to build a well rather than merely dig one. She reached Amos Pruitt a little after noon. He was conscious, gray-faced, one leg pinned under a fall of shale. She could not move alone. She worked for 11 minutes by his son's later count, clearing shale by hand within the boxed cribbing's narrow shelter while the walls around them ticked and settled, and at one point a fist-sized stone dropped from above and struck her shoulder hard enough to buckle her knees in the confined dark. She did not call up for the rope. She widened her stance, braced her forearm against the fresh planking, and kept clearing. When his leg came free, Amos Pruitt could not stand, and Ruth got a rope beneath his arms herself and called up the signal. 2 pulls. Wait. 1 pull. That her grandfather's notebook listed as the old signal for a hoist under load, a signal nobody in Cutter's Flat had used in a generation because nobody dug wells deep enough anymore to need one. Amos Pruitt came up out of his own collapsed well a little before 1 in the afternoon, bruised through the hip, unable to walk unassisted for a week, but alive. He did not thank Ruth Calloway in front of anyone. He did not need to. He gripped her wrist once, hard, with his good hand, before his son and a gathering knot of neighbors carried him toward the wagon, and he said nothing at all. But Ruth understood, watching his eyes, that a debt had been marked down in a ledger of his own that would never be spoken of publicly and would never need to be. The Tanner well and the well she had since finished for Esther Okafor were, by the last week of August, the only 2 water sources within 4 miles still producing at pre-drought volume. The co-op board sent a letter within the month asking her to bid on 3 replacement wells for the basin, cribbed and collared to her grandfather's method. She did not attend the board meeting where the vote was taken. She sent Caleb with her figures instead and stayed home. There was no gathering at the Tanner lot that autumn, no crowd to mark what the basin now understood about the ground it had once called cursed. The town's relief, when it came, was practical and quiet. A contract here, a nod on the street there, and Ruth found she did not much want more than that. What she carried instead was smaller and lived mostly in her own chest. The particular, private knowledge of standing again at the mouth of a well she had once watched fail in front of 41 people, and knowing, this time, exactly why it would hold. In late September, Thomas Reyes wrote once more from Modesto, a short, uncertain letter asking whether there might still be reason to speak of October. Ruth read it on the porch step where the notebook had once been left for her, and set it aside without answering that night or the next. She kept working. The clay collars held. The water, unhurried and very old, kept rising exactly as deep and exactly as slow as her grandfather had always known it would. On a still evening in early October, Ruth sat alone at the Tanner well with Caleb Whitfield, who had by then stopped speaking of Redding altogether, the two of them saying little, passing a tin cup of well water back and forth between them while Solomon grazed nearby, ears finally at ease. She had Eli Calloway's notebook open on her knee, adding her own entry beneath his in a hand grown steadier than it had been in June. She did not write about the collapse or the crowd or what had been lost that October morning a year before. She wrote only the depth, the yield, and the date, and beneath it, in smaller letters, the one line she meant to leave for whoever opened this notebook next. A well that fails once is not a well that will always fail. Ground remembers nothing. Only the digger does, and what she does with the remembering is the only part worth passing on.